I didn't forget. Okay. Again, I'm losing it. Okay. The term that was used for the platform in front of the ark was the duchen. And in Yiddish, that's at least for the Yiddish Eastern European designation. And when the Kohanim, the priests, go up to bless the people, it's called in Yiddish duchen, because they stand on the duchen. In English, we say they're duchening. They're blessing the people because of the duchen. So architecturally, we find the design of synagogues today, whatever's popular. There's no limitation on the style of the synagogue. Traditionally, though, we do have certain setups, one being the idea that the eastern wall, at least in North America, is where the ark will be. So you're going to be entering at least the synagogue proper from the west, which was the reverse of the original synagogues, a reverse of what took place in the temple. And the ark then is on that eastern wall, and you're facing the ark for prayers. And when you're hearing the Torah read, above the ark, above the Aron HaKodesh, is the Ner Tamid. In the more traditional style synagogue, in the middle of the room or in the back of the room, you will have the bima, the platform, and on top of the platform, on top of the bima, will be the shulchan. The shulchan is the table where the Torah is read. Most Ashkenazic synagogues, the seating is facing towards the east. Most people will then be facing in that direction. Even if they're seated in front of the bima, they're facing towards the east. The big shots, especially in old traditional synagogues, the money people, the guys who made sure the synagogue had the money it needed to run, were given the honor of sitting on the eastern wall. That was the privileged place to be. And they might be facing the congregation. Usually the rabbi, officers of the synagogue would have you, if they do sit up there, they face the congregation. But when they're saying the Amidah, the silent prayer, the standing prayer, they would turn and face east. Traditionally, again, the chazan, the cantor, or anybody who was conducting the service, leading the Hebrew chanting of the service, would also face east, not out towards the congregation. When the Torah was being read, once again, it was read in the direction of the east and not out necessarily towards the congregation. All right. So that's the basic. When the Reform movement began in the really the end of the 18th and 19th century, especially basically the 19th century, one of their admitted desires was to emulate in many ways the Protestant church for various reasons that they thought were advantageous, maintaining Jewish commitment. And so they moved everything to the front of the room. Frankly, even unless it's a very small, when it's a small space, it's easier to hear when the person speaking or the person chanting the Torah, or the person chanting the service is facing the congregation. So that was one of the reasons for doing that. There was a tendency to de-emphasize the ark. I remember I had a tour when I first came to Toronto. The rabbi of Holy Blossom, a major Reform congregation here in Toronto, gave me a tour of the building, and he was up front. He says, when they built the building, they intentionally wanted to take away the centrality of the ark as the focal point, and instead made the focal point the pulpit for the rabbi to speak and often lead the service. Similarly, they turned the cantor, if they had a cantor, to face the congregation to chant this, whatever was chanted in the service. Some conservative synagogues emulated that as well. Some kind of did a half and half, when the cantor was not chanting the Amidah or the repetition of the Amidah, he would face the congregation, but for the important elements, he would face the ark. What other changes were there? Well, one of the major ones I'll come to is the nature of the seating. If you remember when I showed you the picture of the temple essentially had it was a rectangular shaped area, and across the middle was a dividing line. And to the east of that dividing line was called Ezrat Nashim, the women's court. The reason it was called that was that women were allowed into that part of the temple precincts. As a matter of fact, we know that there was actually outside of those walls, there were markers that said Gentiles were not permitted to go past a certain point. So it was a gradation. If you were not Jewish, you were not allowed onto the actual temple itself. The courtyard area around the temple, you were allowed, non-Jews were allowed. But once that rectangular area, when you got to the steps that were leading up to it, there were signs in Greek saying no Gentiles were allowed to cross that point. So we have Ezrat Nashim. We know men and women both entered the temple precincts through that area. We know that while men could go past the gate above and for a few feet into the other part of the temple, obviously there would be men in that section, men and women together. The Talmud records that on Sukkot, which we are celebrating right now, they had what I mentioned last week, Simchat Beit HaShoeva, a very celebratory kind of time. And men and women would gather, and there were torches lit, and there were all kinds of things going on. And the rabbis in the Mishnah says they made an innovation. And because they were worried, we have large crowds, they weren't worried about coronavirus, they were worried about men and women behaving the way men and women sometimes do and shouldn't do it in groups. They didn't want too much familiarity between the men and the women during that time. So they established that the men would be inside Ezrat Nashim and the women would be outside, or the women would be the other, or reverse, men inside, women outside, women inside, men outside. Neither way worked. And so finally they put up a balcony in the Ezrat Nashim, the women's court, and women would be on the balcony for the festivities of Simchat Beit HaShoeva. What's clear from that, despite what some of my more Orthodox colleagues might suggest, it means it was only there for that reason, that purpose, that time. The rest of the year, there was no need for it. Someone argued, well, the actual temple, the rules and regulations came from God, and so if he didn't want it separated the sexes, he would not allow them to put up the balcony. But it seems a false argument because it says only for Simchat Beit HaShoeva. Now, so presumably there was no issue about men and women being there. As a matter of fact, if a woman had to bring certain sacrifice, she went up to Nicanor's gate. She couldn't go past it, but she had to be able to go up to Nicanor's gate, be able to see inside to the temple area, seeing the Kohanim, the priests who might be performing various functions while they were doing it, and she would do what she had to do, sometimes as part of the sacrificial requirements. Usually it was for purposes of purification. So now we come to the synagogues. Now, some of the very small synagogues, the reality is we don't know what was done. Some of the synagogues, some of the ones that I showed you, like Kfar Nachum, it seems they had a stairways going on the outside of the building, a staircase. And the question is, was it to a storage space above the synagogue? Or was there an Ezrat Nashim, a women's balcony in the synagogues? There's no way of knowing. Those who defend the mechitza, the separation of men and women during prayer, tend to say, well, it must be they had a mechitza in those days. Others say, we don't know. We don't know. There's no proof. In the Middle Ages, medieval period, we find some of the synagogues did not have a separate section clearly designed for women to be in. Does that mean it can be interpreted one of two ways? One way of interpreting it is that men and women sat together. Another way of interpreting it is women generally didn't go to the synagogue. And both are possibilities. We don't know. We really don't know. Rabbi Wayne Allen was doing some research a few years ago on a question about the Brit Milah, if a woman can serve as the Sandeket. The Sandek is the individual who holds the baby for the Brit Milah during the time of the circumcision. Sometimes they have a real job. An example today, Baruch Hashem, my newest grandchild had his Brit Milah, so I was the Sandek, and I had to hold his legs when the Moyle was doing his thing. Okay, so Rabbi Allen, in researching it, came across a responsum in which the Maharami Rothenberg, Rabbi Meir of Rothenberg, was opposed to the woman serving in this capacity. Why? Because he says she sits in her Shabbat finery amongst the men. Now, until relatively recently, the Brit Milah usually took place at the end of the synagogue service. That's why in some communities, they say Aleinu after a Brit Milah ceremony. And the implication being, perhaps, unless that's how Rabbi Allen wants to interpret it, is that the woman was there for the Shacharit service amongst the men. And the Maharami Rothenberg didn't like that. He didn't think it was proper. And that's why he didn't want her to serve as the Sandeket, because otherwise she wouldn't have been in shul. In Prague, if you ever get the chance to go to Prague, it's a wonderful place to visit for both Jewish and non-Jewish aspects. But in what they call the Oct.7 Schule, there is a synagogue. It's pretty tiny. But there was a room built on afterwards in the back of the synagogue. And it was added on, we know, because the walls of the synagogue were very thick. And you have windows that were, coming down, and I don't know, I remember there was the thickness, not between the width of the window, but the thickness in and out. I don't know how my hand's going here to do anything. I'm making you dizzy. All right. But the distance from the out wall to the inner wall was really something like this. Okay. And you had the window on the far side of it. So in the back of the room, they put another room outside of that back wall where those windows were. And that became the Ezrat Nashim. Now, again, the question then is, does that mean women didn't go to synagogue before then? Did it mean that they went to synagogue and sat with the men? Did it mean they wanted to go to the synagogue, and since they couldn't sit with the men, they decided to add a room on the back of the synagogue? Okay, that's a question which you can't really truly know the answer to. However, by the late Middle Ages, early modern period, we know that in general, men and women did not sit together in the synagogue. Most of the synagogues that were built had a balcony. Women sat in the balcony and were not mixed in with the men during synagogue services. When the Reform movement began, one of the early changes, or one of the changes they made, maybe not even necessarily, because there were Reform synagogues very late that had separate seating, But one of the changes that the Reform movement promoted was what they called family pews, families sitting together for synagogue services. And the non-Orthodox world in general took that up. And today, one of the clear-cut differences between an Orthodox and a non-Orthodox synagogue is the existence of a mechitza, a barrier between men and women. Even some of the traditionalist-minded rabbis insist that you have to have a balcony, that you can't have men and women on the same level with a wall, at least 5-foot high wall separating the sexes. And on the other hand, there are many synagogues that do have men and women separated, but they have them on the same floor, but with a wall. That's what they usually refer to as the mechitza, separating them. And the women's side being the Ezrat Nashim, or the women's up in the balcony being the Ezrat Nashim. Another change that came about in synagogue service life was the downplaying in some ways the role of the cantor in the Reform movement and elevating the role of the rabbi conducting the service. And that's kind of changed quite a bit today in the Reform world, depending upon the synagogue. But the chanting of the service was changed in many ways. And of course, another major difference that you find between more traditional synagogues and the liberal elements is the existence of microphones for the synagogue, which of course makes it easier for people to hear, but it opens up all kinds of questions that they may have for the use or not use of electricity on Shabbat and holidays. But we do know, just getting back to the Mechitza one real quickly, in the 1950s, it was when the line was beginning to be drawn in the sand. The Orthodox synagogue movement began to insist that if you're going to be a member of the Orthodox movement, you could not have mixed seating. There were a lot of synagogues that call themselves traditional. They would have maybe the first 2 rows were separate seating, men on one side, women on the other. And after that, people sat together. Some called themselves Orthodox and had mixed seating. And so they cracked down so that till today, you won't find any synagogue that is allowed to be a member of the Union of Orthodox Congregations or one of the other Orthodox synagogue movements that have mixed seating for prayer. And I dare say what has happened is even the separation of the sexes has become even more profound in many more right-wing Orthodox synagogues. So that I know there are synagogues that don't even allow men and women to be together for the Kiddush after services. And they have to be separate for that. All right. So that's the basic structure in terms of the synagogue. Are there any questions right now what we've done so far? Anybody have a question? No questions? All right. The synagogue, today the modern synagogue is normally an independent organization. In the modern era, there are not community synagogues in the sense that we have still in Europe to some extent sometimes, where the community people pay Jewish tax monies, and then those are used to maintain the synagogues of the community. But here in Toronto and throughout North America, each synagogue is incorporated. It's a private institution, and it has its own bylaws and governance rules, membership rules, and they may vary from synagogue to synagogue on how they function. But essentially, it's a members' institution, right? You become a member of a synagogue. and you pay dues to that synagogue depending upon the nature of that synagogue, how they decide what the dues should be, family dues, individual dues. It's not, that each synagogue may have a little difference on that point. But that's how you become a member of the synagogue, and that gives you rights and privileges in the synagogue. Usually also the question of being able to vote on those issues that are synagogue issues. All right? And so the more traditional synagogues, and certainly the more Orthodox synagogues, do have normally as part of their setup that the rabbi is what we call in Aramaic, Mara Da'atra, literally the master of the place. And it is up to the rabbi to decide those issues of halacha, of Jewish ritual practice. Many synagogues, when they hire the rabbi, they give him, and I'm using the word him because that's usually only in Orthodox circles that is that to that extent. Although my synagogue, where I was a rabbi, my synagogue, I was the Mar Da'atra, literally in that sense. And I'll come back to it. So they give the right of all that decision making to the rabbi. So ritual considerations, who can have an aliyah to the Torah, sometimes even who can be a member of the synagogue, is up to the rabbi. His hands are certainly tied to a certain extent. If it's an Orthodox synagogue, clearly there's certain limitations that are going to be there. And if he is an Orthodox synagogue, he does something that's not Orthodox, believe me, all hell will break loose. Well, let's say right now, okay, we have in the middle of this coronavirus. Who decides what can be eliminated from the synagogue service under the emergency situations? Who decides whether or not you can broadcast the synagogue service on Shabbat or Yom Tov? The Rav of the shul, the rabbi. Right? So that I know in most of the synagogues, in the Orthodox world for sure, that's what has taken place. He may consult with other rabbis, may consult with various fora, but he decides what the policy, religious policy is. And if the synagogue people don't like it, since the synagogue is an independent organization and they hire the rabbi, depending on the nature of the contract with the rabbi, they can say at the end of his contractual period, goodbye. And that sometimes happens when they have unhappy with the rulings that the rabbi is making. I mentioned about getting together during the Kiddush. I know there was one synagogue in town, in Toronto area, may nameless, that the rabbi insisted that at the Kiddushes, men and women had to be separated. And when his contract was up, he was no longer rabbi of that synagogue. Okay? But as long as he is the rabbi, they are duty bound to him to decide. In the non-Orthodox world, as I was saying, when I was a rabbi, Shar Shalom Synagogue of blessed memory, it no longer exists, I was the one who determined the religious policy. Now, and the first step is, what is a religious policy? What is a religious ruling? And I tried very carefully to make sure I distinguished between what was up to, a religious ruling and what was not. Right? So I know I've heard of rabbis who want to say the color of the carpeting was up to the rabbi. Believe me, I'm terrible on colors, so I certainly would not want that responsibility. Right? But I had the responsibility of deciding ritual practice. I did have many synagogues, and even Orthodox synagogues, will have a ritual committee. The ritual committee in some synagogues is a sounding board for the rabbi. They can advise the rabbi. They can say what they hear people feeling, and they give their opinions, what have you. And then the rabbi makes the decision. Or there are some synagogues in which the rabbi is part of the ritual committee, and the ritual committee has the power to make the final decision. So the rabbi has a very strong voice in those synagogues at the ritual committee. but he or she does not make the final decision. It may be up to the ritual committee. And sometimes if it's a major issue, it may go to the board of directors of the synagogue. So it depends on how it is structured in terms of those policies. I don't know, did I share a story with you about women in dresses and pants? No, I haven't. All right, let me share you a story how it works. Many years ago, when I was Rabbi Shar Shalom, one of the things that women did do in my synagogue there is they chanted the Megillat Ruth on the holiday of Shavuot. The women had the tradition of reciting that book. And some of them wanted to be able to wear slacks to shul to participate that way. You know, if women wanted to show up in pants, they could show up in pants. But it was the policy that to have a part in any kind of public role in the synagogue during it, women had to wear a skirt and a top too, by the way, in case you were wondering. Okay, at least somebody smiled, a few of you. Anyway, so the issue was being raised, and was being brought to the ritual committee, and I was asked first about it, and I said, as far as I'm concerned, while I have my preferences, I find nothing. If a woman wants to wear slacks, nice slacks to shul, that's fine. That's her prerogative. I had no problems with it. Some more right-wing rabbis have problems with women wearing slacks. That's their issue, not mine. So I said, as far as I was concerned, it was not a ritual issue. It was a synagogue practice, and so it would be up to the ritual committee to make that decision. But interestingly enough, while we were talking about that, some of the men raised the question about whether or not a man had to wear a tie when he was called up for an aliyah to the Torah. And so we were all expecting this long, big battle over whether or not women could wear slacks in the synagogue if they were participating in service. And there was no big deal about that. That was over 1, 2, 3. But we spent an hour or two on whether or not a man had to wear a tie. So go figure. But anyway, that was my decision. If I had said otherwise, if I said, no, this is a decision for the rabbi to make, then it would have been up to me to make that decision, right? Because that's the synagogue recognized that. Right? Okay, so you have that division. Now, many synagogues also hire a cantor. The English word cantor, in Hebrew, chazan. It's becoming less prevalent now, and I think with the way financial issues that are coming up, you'll see maybe even less. But the role of the chazan in the synagogue is to chant the service, especially the services that are more intricate, the holiday services, the Sabbath services. Some synagogues are just done by lay people. Some synagogues, rabbis will also chant the service. But the cantor is hired by the synagogue to manage the music of the synagogue. And so that is his or her function in the synagogue, depending upon the synagogue. And obviously, a synagogue service is going to have two people involved in conducting what's going on, the rabbi and the cantor. And that's why famously there are often disputes and fights and all kinds of nasty things between rabbis and cantors. Who really runs the show and who's going to be the top dog in the synagogue service. And depends on the synagogue, the strength of the rabbi, the strength of the cantor as to who does what. Getting back to the rabbi though, okay, in the modern synagogue, rabbis are hired by the synagogue, so their first duty is to the synagogue. And the rabbi in today's world, it fulfills the role, actually it says on my certificate of ordination, rabbi, preacher, and teacher. The rabbinic part is deciding Jewish law and ritual. The preacher to preach, to give sermons, to give guidance to the synagogue in those areas. To teach, various ways of teaching within the synagogue. Also, the rabbi serves as the, what in English they call it pastoral responsibilities, to visit the sick, to deal with people who have issues. So the rabbis are hired by the synagogue to fulfill all of those different roles, and that hopefully is the training that a rabbi gets when preparing for that function. But rabbis are also assumed to be part of the community, general community. And so most rabbis also feel they have an obligation beyond their own synagogue for the general community as well, and involvement as much as possible where they can in the general community and the people who have needs and in various functions. So most rabbis in Toronto will serve on a board of rabbis. As a board of rabbis, each of the different rabbinic groups have their own, their conservative rabbis, the Orthodox rabbis, the Reform rabbis have their groups, and they work together for various kinds of things. And then sometimes outside of the Jewish community, rabbis may function on clerical boards and for things like that, and involvement in community issues above and beyond that. We know, for example, in the American South during the Civil Rights era, there were many rabbis, especially in the Reform movement, who took very courageous stands in opposition to segregation policies in the South. And some of them paid with their jobs. They were, run out of town by their congregants because they didn't agree with what they had to say. But that is part of the role of a rabbi as well. If a rabbi is not associated with the synagogue, they may have other kinds of functions that they do. Many are teachers. Sometimes they serve as chaplains. Sometimes they serve in roles at various Jewish organizations in that manner. So rabbis do that. Rabbis are empowered by the province to perform weddings. In order to do a wedding in Ontario, you have to be licensed by the province. And clergy can generally get that. It depends on certain things they have to do. But the rabbis, when they come into Toronto, in some way or another, get a license. I have a license to perform weddings. Right? And the record keeping has to go with that, which we'll talk about in the spring. Chazanim, also the cantors often are involved together as well and have various community aspects of what they do beyond their own four walls of their synagogue. Many synagogues will have an education director. The educational director will run the synagogue school. Sometimes the rabbi himself runs it or the cantor runs it, or sometimes the bigger ones, like Beth Tzedek has several rabbis who have different functions in the synagogue itself. And there may be other personnel, a youth director, other kinds of positions that are in the synagogue. And of course, that's where the cost of running the synagogue comes in. That's why you have, the physical plant has to be taken care of. And that's where the dues cover, but very few synagogues cover everything through dues. But and that's why they have to do fundraising, various kinds of fundraising. One of the major differences, and I speak to non-Jewish clergy, is the fact that we can't pass the hat on the major holidays. In the church, right? They pass the bucket around, the hat around for donations. We can get people to volunteer. We sometimes have drives on Shabbos and Yom Tov, but we certainly can't really pass the hat every Saturday, every Shabbos. Though we'll find in some synagogues during the weekdays, they will have a push that goes around, lack of a better term in English, a charity box for people to donate to. But because of the need of the synagogue, that's why membership is an important element of the synagogue. That's why members get certain kinds of special rights in the synagogue, and for holding a bar mitzvah or something like that. They usually have different costs for members versus non-members, seating for the holidays versus non-members. All those kinds of things are part of, after all, if I'm going to pay dues to a synagogue, what am I getting for my dues? right? And to say you're getting a rabbi and a cantor when you need it, and if they don't come to the synagogue very often, what do I need it for? Which is one of the challenges that synagogues are going to face right now because of the nature of the world we're living in at the moment. Most synagogues are associated with one of the synagogue movements. There is a movement for the conservative synagogues, United Synagogues, which conservative synagogues many belong to. They don't necessarily belong. If they belong, they pay dues to that organization. In itself, it sets up certain criteria. For example, in order to be a member of a conservative, as a conservative synagogue, there's certain rules. You have to have yarmulkes and the talit, and you have to keep at least some level of kashrut as part of the synagogue policy. Orthodox synagogues, for example, I mentioned the idea of mechitza. You won't be able to join any Orthodox synagogue body if you don't have mechitza, and other kinds of things. The Reform movement have their own rules, obviously not as stringent in those terms. Certainly all of them have rules. You got to pay your dues. Can't be a member of the organization without paying your dues. And those two, we'll talk more about the various groups in the Jewish world today later on. Lots of challenges today in those areas. But the synagogue has been a mainstay of the Jewish community. It's one of the first institutions that were established when the Jewish community really gets going in an area. It serves as a very vital aspect of the community. So, at least pre-recent years, we had a lot of synagogues that also were, in a sense, like a synagogue center. They had all kinds of social activities above and beyond religious services. When I grew up in the town that I grew up in, Jacksonville, Florida, my synagogue was not, even though it technically had a Hebrew name, it was known by everybody as the Jacksonville Jewish Center, not a center like the center we have here, but it was a synagogue, a conservative synagogue, but it had all those kinds of facilities because that's how they saw themselves. And so it was organized that way. Some synagogues merely function as a place for prayer and study, and everything in between those two. And that's reflected in how they maintain themselves and membership dues and all that sort of thing. For example, there is a shul in town called the Boat Shul. Why the Boat Shul? Because it was originally apparently there was a boat store in this place, and later on became a synagogue. And it's famous because it has minyanim all day long. You want a minyan any time for mincha until sunset, you can find one every few minutes. At nighttime, you can find one every few minutes until around midnight or something. They do have membership, but a lot of people just pop in when they need to say Kaddish to join with the minyan. Then you have like Chabad synagogues, which they often have very low membership dues because they do a lot of heavy fundraising and get money from various donors so that they don't have to pay high dues. They'll get the money from you some other way. And sometimes in those synagogues, especially since the Chabad rabbis often really create the synagogue, they really run it. Everything is answerable to the rabbi in those cases. So that's really pretty much it for tonight. And that's like I say, unless you've got some questions anybody has that they want to raise now.
Yes, I have just from curiosity.
Yeah.
The Chabad movement is considered Orthodox, or it's their own?
Very clearly, they're part of the Orthodox world today. Interestingly enough, and we'll talk about the development of the movements later on, when they began, they were considered to be on the outside. All Hasidic groups, not just Chabad. All Hasidic groups were considered to be kind of subversive of the current Jewish state of affairs. And if you want, they were the reform movement of their day. And there was a lot of fighting. But as time went on, the various Hasidic groups became more accepted in the Orthodox world and became more of a fact of that. But even they have arguments amongst themselves. Famously, many years ago, there was a protest. It doesn't matter the details, but one of the Hasidim who were out marching around this Yeshiva University at the time, an Orthodox institution, and said, well, what about the Chabad rabbi? Is he in favor of this? And he says, he's not, the Chabad aren't Jewish. And at least they're not Hasidim. They're no good. They're nishkefel. We don't need them. So, you have, animosities, inter-rivalries all over the place. You always say, right? 2 Jews, 3 opinions. But yeah, today they clearly are very much part of the Orthodox world.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, anybody else? No? Okay. So God willing, we'll see each other next week. I don't know if any of you are going to shul. Simchas Torah used to be really lots of fun, but I don't think it's going to be so much fun today in this world. Maybe God willing, next year you'll see what Simchat Torah can be like. All right, everybody. Good night.